The night of January 28, 1945, on the Philippine island of Luzon is split open by the shriek of tank tracks and the hammer of 47mm cannon fire. A wave of 13 Japanese armored vehicles, their hulls draped in cut bamboo and caked mud from the surrounding rice paddies, lunges out of the darkened streets of San Manuel directly into the forward foxholes of the American 161st Infantry Regiment. Tracers skip off angular turret faces, the supersonic snap of passing rounds punctuating the shouts of infantrymen scrambling for bazookas and rifle grenades. The gunners of two 37mm anti-tank guns spinning their trails toward the muzzle flashes erupting barely 150 yards away. The lead tank, a Type 97 Kai Shinhoto Chi-Ha, with its distinctive squat turret and long-barreled 47mm gun, crushes a strand of concertina wire and slews its tracks, spraying machine gun fire blindly into the American perimeter. A rocket-propelled grenade corkscrews from a bazooka tube strikes the thinner side armor just above the bogey wheels, and for a split second the vehicle's silhouette is backlit by the white-hot jet of a shaped charge boring through 26mm of Japanese face-hardened plate. The tank shudders to a halt, its hatches remain closed, and behind it 10 more machines are being stopped in rapid succession, hit by anti-tank shells, by 50-caliber slugs cracking through vision slits, by men hurling rifle grenades from so close they can smell the diesel exhaust. Inside his command post, Major General Isao Shigemi, the commander of the Japanese 3rd Armored Brigade, listens to the crescendo of fire and the silence that follows it, and he understands that his last counterstroke has failed. Within hours he will perform the ritual act that ends a samurai's command, and San Manuel, the town he swore to defend to the death, will pass into American hands along with 41 smashed medium tanks and 4 light tanks left smoking in their revetments. The annihilation of Japan's premier armored force on Luzon was never supposed to happen, not to the division that had been forged in Manchuria as the sword of the Kwantung Army, but the roots of that destruction had been planted years earlier, on a battlefield 2,000 miles from the Philippines, where the Imperial Japanese Army had first learned just how fragile a thin-skinned tank could be. The calendar reads July 1939, and on the broad, windswept steppe of Manchuria near a bend in the Khalkhin-Gol River, the soldiers of the Japanese 1st Tank Group are discovering that courage cannot deflect a high-velocity armor-piercing shell. They have crossed the border into a disputed zone claimed by the Soviet Union, expecting the Red Army's infantry to break, as infantry had always broken against the bayonets of the Kwantung Army, but instead they have driven into a layered kill sack of dug-in 45mm anti-tank guns and fast-moving BT-7 cavalry tanks. The Japanese Type 89 Shiro medium tank, riveted machine designed in the late 1920s with a short-barreled 57mm low-velocity gun and armor barely sufficient to stop heavy machine gun bullets, is being stitched through by Soviet shells at ranges where its own rounds drop uselessly into the grass. By the time the smoke clears over the Holka River, 42 of the 73 tanks committed by Lieutenant General Masaomi Yasuoka are burned-out hulks, their riveted seams popped open, their crews incinerated. The shock in Tokyo is profound. Japanese tankers, many of them the Army's most technically proficient soldiers, have been crushed by an adversary equipped to contemporary European standards. A single deficiency stands out above all others. The Japanese tank guns simply cannot penetrate sloping Soviet armor at combat distances, while the Soviet 45mm weapon can kill any Japanese tank from any angle. The Imperial Army's technical branches immediately begin work on a new 47mm high-velocity gun, a weapon that can punch through 67mm of vertical steel at 500 yards, and they order a crash program to fit it into a redesigned turret on the existing Type 97 Chi-Ha chassis. But the frantic improvisation that follows the Nomonhan disaster, the crash design of the Shinhoto Chi-Ha, the emergency shipment of the first 10 prototypes to the Philippines in the spring of 1942, the sight of Captain Hideo Ho riding onto the rocky beach of Corregidor on the night of May 5th, standing in the open hatch of a captured American M3 light tank, while 5 of the new Type 97 Kai machines ground up the slope behind him, comes far too late to re-equip the tank force at scale. The new turret, with its welded face and 47mm cannon works. The tanks silence American bunkers, they crack pillboxes, and the garrison surrenders. But the industrial priority for tank production has already been slashed from A1 to D. The mass manufacture of the new model will never catch up with the regiments already deployed across the Pacific. and the qualitative gap between Japan's thin-skinned improvisations and the American medium tank that will meet them on Luzon in 1945 is now locked irrevocably into steel. In June 1942, as the Imperial General Staff digested victory after victory, the fledgling 2nd Armored Division coalesced on the dusty plains of Manchuria. The formation was built on paper for a Soviet war that had never come. 4 tank regiments, a single motorized infantry regiment, and a mobile artillery regiment, a structure that looked impressive on an order of battle but contained a fatal weakness. The division's 4 tank regiments massed nearly 200 machines, yet its infantry contingent was barely a third the size of a comparable American armored division. Major General Yoshiharu Iwanaka, the head of the Chiba Tank School and a veteran of the Wuhan offensive, monitored these developments from Tokyo. He would not take command of the division until January 1944. On the vast maneuver grounds of Mutanchiang, Lieutenant Colonel Takao Maeda's 7th Tank Regiment drilled in sweeping encirclements against imaginary Soviet corps, their Type 97 Kai Shinhoto Chiha tanks charging across the steppe, with the long-barreled 47mm gun leading the way. But the industrial foundation beneath those maneuvers was crumbling. In Tokyo, the War Ministry had already slashed tank production priority from A1 to D, redirecting steel and factory floors to warships and aircraft. The Mitsubishi plant that fabricated the Shinhoto Chiha's welded turret received shrinking allocations of nickel-steel armor plate, while the specialized optics workshops that ground the 4-power telescopic sights fell further behind schedule. A young conscript named Corporal Shirayama, drafted in January 1942 and assigned to the 10th Tank Regiment as a gunner, remembered the creeping scarcity even on the training ranges. His English comprehension got him pulled into radio courses, but the crystal-controlled Type C Mark I sets remained so precious that only platoon and company commanders received them. The rest of the tank crews communicated with signal flags and runners. The Ordnance Department had solved the Sherman's most lethal flaw, its tendency to burst into a catastrophic ammunition fire when penetrated, not by thickening the armor, but by moving the 75mm shells from vulnerable Spunson bins to the floor beneath the turret, and encasing them in lightly armored racks surrounded by a jacket of water mixed with antifreeze. American combat analysts later concluded that while 60 to 80% of dry stowage Shermans burned when hit, only 10 to 15% of the new wet stowage tanks suffered the same fate. That same March, the last Type 97 Kai Shinhoto Chiha rolled off the Hitachi assembly line. Japanese tank production, which had peaked at barely 1,200 vehicles per year in its best months, now ceased entirely for the medium tank that equipped every armored regiment outside the home islands. The IJA would fight the rest of the war with what it already had. On May 21, 1944, the 716th Tank Battalion steamed under the Golden Gate Bridge aboard a troopship bound for New Guinea. The battalion's 53 M4A3 Shermans, 6 105mm assault guns, and 17 M5A1 light tanks had been lashed to the weather decks, their deep-wading trunks and waterproofing compound a silent promise of the amphibious war to come. The unit had been born in chaos. Originally the 3rd Battalion of the 48th Armored Regiment, it was severed from its parent division during the Great Reorganization of 1943, converted into an independent tank battalion, and then assigned to no infantry division in particular. Its men, many of them draftees from the Midwest who had never seen the ocean before basic training, had trained hard in the Louisiana maneuvers and the Texas gunnery ranges, but they had never once exercised with a full infantry regiment in a combined live-fire assault. The tank infantry communication gap was already a known problem in the European theatre, where field telephones were being jury-rigged onto hulls, but in the Pacific the separate battalions remained orphans, expected to integrate on the beach under fire. 3,000 miles to the northwest, the Japanese 2nd Armored Division was being systematically hollowed out. In Manchuria, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the victor of Malaya, studied intelligence reports on American amphibious doctrine with growing unease. An infantry officer by training and instinct, Yamashita had long doubted the utility of massed armor in defensive island warfare, and his skepticism was hardening into doctrine. In January 1944, the Kwantung Army stripped Iwanaka's division of its 11th Tank Regiment, sending it north to the Kurilai Islands to face the Soviets. In February 1944, the division's reconnaissance regiment was detached and reconstituted as the 27th Tank Regiment on Okinawa, and its anti-aircraft regiment was siphoned off to China. When orders finally arrived to embark for Luzon in August 1944, the division that loaded onto transports at Puzon was a skeleton of its former self: 3 understrength tank regiments, a single mobile infantry battalion, and a handful of self-propelled guns, already bleeding men to malaria and dengue fever before they even heard a shot fired. Far to the south, on the island of New Caledonia, Colonel James Dalton's 161st Infantry Regiment was refitting after nearly a year of continuous combat in the jungles of Guadalcanal and New Georgia. His men, the few hundred survivors of the original cadre that had waded ashore in the Solomons in December 1942, were veterans of a kind of war utterly foreign to the tankers. They had fought through green hells where armor could not follow, where the enemy was a sniper in a palm tree or a machine gun buried in a log bunker, and where the idea of tanks fighting tanks seemed like a rumor from another world. Dalton knew, from dispatches and rumors, that the next campaign would be different, that the Philippines, with its broad central plains and paved highways, was tank country. But his regiment had never trained with an attached tank company, and the institutional lessons bought with blood on Leyte in the months ahead would have to be learned all over again on Luzon. The two armies, one frozen in technological adolescence and the other still fumbling toward combined arms maturity, were drifting toward a collision that neither had been built to fight. The summer of 1944 shattered the Imperial Army's most fundamental tactical assumption. On Saipan in June, the 9th Tank Regiment had launched a classic waterline defense counterattack against the American beachhead, charging into the surf zone at night with over 40 tanks. By the following morning, the regiment was a field of smoldering hulks, its commander dead and its vehicles scattered across the coral like broken toys. 2 months later, on Peleliu, the tank company of the 14th Division repeated the same script, racing across the airfield in broad daylight against marine positions, and it too was annihilated before it closed to effective range. These twin disasters ripped through Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo with the force of a naval bombardment, exposing the bankruptcy of a doctrine built around the reflex of the immediate counterstroke. In mid-August 1944, the Army Ministry released the Essentials of Island Defense, the first major revision of Japanese tactical doctrine since 1928. The new manual flatly rejected water's edge fighting in favor of a protracted inland defense built on layered fortified lines, reverse slope positions, and deeply dug in heavy weapons. By October, the doctrine hardened further into a formal rejection of beachline counter amphibious operations altogether. The shift was enormously controversial within the officer corps, but it arrived just in time to shape the defense of the Philippines. As the staff officers absorbed the lessons of the Marianas, the hollowed-out 2nd Armored Division was already loading its tanks and skeletal infantry battalions onto transports at Pusan, bound for Luzon. The division that staggered ashore at Manila in early September bore almost no resemblance to the formation that had trained on the plains of Manchuria. It had been stripped of its 11th Tank Regiment, dispatched to the Kuriles Islands. Its reconnaissance regiment was now the 27th Tank Regiment, pinned down on Okinawa. Its anti-aircraft regiment was gone, siphoned off to China. What remained were 3 understrength tank regiments, 1 battalion of motorized infantry, and a fever-stricken rank and file. Nearly a third of its men were already incapacitated by malaria and dengue fever within weeks of landing. This was the force that Major General Yoshiharu Iwanaka would have to wield as the shield of northern Luzon, though he did not yet know it. On October 20, 1944, General Walter Kruger's 6th Army crashed ashore on the eastern coast of Leyte, triggering an immediate crisis in Tokyo. The Imperial General Headquarters, which had long debated whether to hoard its reserves for Luzon or commit them to the defense of Leyte, made the catastrophic decision to reinforce failure. 5 Japanese divisions were fed into the meat grinder of the Leyte campaign, including 2 light tank companies peeled away from the 2nd Armored Division. By the time the fighting on Leyte sputtered to its bloody conclusion in late December, the 14th Area Army on Luzon had been bled of formations that it would desperately need in the weeks to come. The stage was set for General Tomoyuki Yamashita, newly appointed to command the defense of the main island, to make the cruelest calculation of his career. Yamashita arrived on Luzon, carrying the laurels of his Malayan campaign, but he harbored no illusions about what awaited him. He was an infantry officer to his marrow, and he regarded the sprawling, under-infantried 2nd Armored Division with unconcealed skepticism. The original plan, to concentrate the Armored Division on the Central Plains as a mobile counterattack force to strike the flank of any American advance toward Manila, collapsed within days of his arrival. The plain was simply too exposed to American air power, and the division lacked the organic anti-aircraft protection to maneuver in daylight. Instead, Yamashita divided the island into 3 mountain bastions: the Shobu Group in the north, the Kembu Group around Clark Field, and the Shimbu Group east of Manila, and scattered the Armored Division's regiments into a string of blocking positions that could delay but never defeat the coming invasion. The 2nd Armored Division's combat manual, issued on November 15th, captured the desperate spiritual calculus of the moment. This Philippines battle will end either in the annihilation of the American devils or in the complete destruction of our forces. The decisive day is drawing near. The manual then added a sentence that betrayed the profound technological anxiety gnawing at the officer corps. Emphasis must be placed on anti-tank combat, especially against their heavy tanks. Our lack of armament is more than equaled by our divine ability and superior tactics. The words were bravado, masking a grim reality. The division's 47mm guns could not reliably penetrate the frontal armor of the American M4 Sherman, except at suicidal ranges measured in tens of yards. The gunners knew it, the company commanders knew it, and Major General Iwanaka, watching his division being carved up into disconnected battle groups, knew it most of all. The first week of January 1945 brought the inevitable Japanese reconnaissance, picked up the massive concentration of American naval forces moving toward Lingayen Gulf, the same broad bay where the Imperial Army had landed its own invasion force 3 years earlier. On January 6th, American battleships began a preliminary bombardment of the beach area, their shells churning the sand and pummeling the coconut groves. Yamashita's headquarters issued a flurry of orders, committing the 2nd Armored Division to its final configuration. The Takayama Group, built around the 2nd Mobile Infantry Regiment, was already fixed in place defending Clark Field. The main body of the division, the Ida Group with the 6th Tank Regiment and the Harada Group with the 10th, was ordered toward the Ogno River line to serve as a potential counterattack force. And the vanguard, the Shigemi Group under Major General Isao Shigemi, was dispatched to plug the eastern shoulder of the beachhead at San Manuel, a dusty crossroads town that would soon become a name written in fire. On the morning of January 9, 1945, the leading waves of Lieutenant General Innes Swift's 1st Corps ground onto the beaches of Lingayen Gulf. The 716th Tank Battalion, its 53 Shermans, still fitted with deep wading trunks from the amphibious assault, landed in direct support of the 43rd Division. Company B and Company C were immediately parceled out, one company per infantry regiment, exactly as the US Army's modular doctrine prescribed, and exactly as its critics had feared. These tankers had never trained with the infantry they were now ordered to protect. They shared no common radio frequencies with the rifle platoons. Their gunners squinted through periscopes at terrain that obscured every potential ambush. And somewhere ahead of them, hidden in the bamboo thickets and the rice paddy dikes, the Shinhoto-chi Has of the 7th Tank Regiment were already burrowing into their revetments, their commanders watching the horizon and waiting for the American armor to close the range. Colonel James Dalton's 161st Regimental Combat Team, still aboard its landing craft in the surf, had no way of knowing that its path would intersect with the heaviest concentration of Japanese armor on Luzon. The regiment was a veteran outfit, bloodied on Guadalcanal and New Georgia, but it had never operated with an attached tank company in combined arms assault. Its soldiers trusted their rifles, their bazookas, and their 37mm anti-tank guns. They did not yet trust the steel beasts that were supposed to lead them into the kills. By nightfall on January 9th, the advance elements of the Shigemi Group were already marching towards San Manuel through the choking dust of the central Luzon roads. The collision was now inevitable. Two armored forces, one technological and the other tactical, both untested in the unforgiving crucible of Pacific combined arms warfare, closing on a modest grid of streets and buildings that would soon be reduced to ash and twisted armor plate. On January 17th, a platoon of 3 M4A3 Shermans from Company A of the 716th Tank Battalion rumbled toward the town of Urdaneta, supporting an infantry advance by the 6th Division. The platoon leader, First Lieutenant Robert Courtwright, pushed forward through scattered rifle fire and the distant thump of Japanese mortars. Hidden in a dense mango grove on the left flank, Warrant Officer Kojura Wada of the 3rd Company, 7th Tank Regiment, waited with 3 Type 97 Kai Shinhoto Chi-Ha tanks, their 47mm guns trained on the dirt road. Wada had warned his crews to hold fire until the American tanks exposed their vulnerable side plates. He knew the frontal armor of a Sherman would stop his shells at anything but point-blank range. The range closed to 35 yards. Wada's 3 tanks fired in rapid succession. 2 Shermans were disabled immediately, including Courtwright's, their side armor drilled through by the 47mm armor, piercing high-explosive shells. The 3rd Sherman, commanded by Sergeant Schrift, took a hit that ripped a track off its running gear. The driver swung the tank hard using the undamaged track, slewing the thick glacis plate toward the muzzle flashes in the mango grove. Schrift's gunner acquired Wada's tank through the M71D telescope, and the 75mm gun cracked once, striking the Japanese tank in the engine compartment and hull, and setting it ablaze. Wada died inside that turret. The remaining 2 Japanese tanks kept firing, their shells ringing off the Sherman's frontal slope like hammer blows. Sergeant Kokai's tank took a direct hit through the gun mantlet and brewed up. Wada's last surviving commander, Sergeant Suzuki, maneuvered for a shot at Schrift's thinner flank, but before he could settle his aim, the American 75mm gun fired again. His Shinhoto Chi-Ha disintegrated. Schrift and his crew were awarded the Silver Star. All 3 Japanese tanks lay wrecked in the mango grove, while Schrift's battered Sherman was repaired that same night. In 2 days of skirmishing around Binalonan and Urdaneta, the forward detachments of the Shigemi Group lost 19 Type 97 medium tanks and 3 Type 95 light tanks. One Japanese tanker, recording his diary as the survivors pulled back toward San Manuel, wrote, "It's pitiful. The raid failed. The commanders of the Takaki Tank Detachment, 2nd Infantry Company, 2 tank platoon commanders, and 1 infantry platoon leader were all killed. 6 tanks were destroyed, and the 2 infantry companies lost half their troops. The 7th Tank Regiment had been mauled, its 3rd and 5th Company commanders both dead in the fighting. Major General Isao Shigemi, commanding the 3rd Armored Brigade, pulled his battered force into the town of San Manuel and issued an order on January 20th that locked the garrison into a suicidal stand. The group will defend its present position to the death. The enemy must be annihilated, and we will hold San Manuel at all costs." San Manuel had been transformed into a fortress of tank revetments. Japanese engineers and tank crews had carved deep pits into the earthen dikes of the surrounding rice paddies, lowering each Shinhoto Chi-Ha until only its turret and gun mantlet showed above the ground. The tanks were camouflaged with thick clumps of bamboo and palm fronds. Their positions staggered so that every approach road fell within overlapping fields of fire. Inside the town, additional revetments lined the main streets and intersections, creating an inner defense ring. Artillery pieces, 6 105mm howitzers, 7 75mm field guns, and 2 47mm anti-tank guns were dug into similar emplacements. The Shigemi Group marshaled about 50 tanks and roughly 1,000 troops. Many of them, service personnel pressed into rifle pits and suicide raiding teams. Colonel James Dalton, commanding the 161st Regimental Combat Team of the 25th Division, began probing San Manuel on January 19th with a patrol of M5A1 light tanks led by Lieutenant John Griffin. The light tanks reached the western outskirts before the Japanese opened fire at close range, destroying 2 M5A1s and killing 7 crewmen. Dalton recognized that he faced a heavily fortified position, and he took an unusual decision. The 161st Infantry had never trained with an attached tank company, and his regimental officers instinctively distrusted the Shermans. Dalton preferred his organic cannon company, 6 M7 105mm self-propelled howitzers, whose high explosive shells could strip away camouflage and demolish lightly armored Japanese tanks. He also secured the 98th Chemical Mortar Battalion, with its 4.2-inch mortars, and several field artillery battalions to pound the town before the assault. At 0700 hours on January 24th, the attack opened with a 15-minute artillery barrage that blanketed the southwestern edge of San Manuel. Captain John Huntington's Company C of the 716th Tank Battalion led the advance of 1st Battalion, 161st Infantry, closing to within 300 yards of the town before the barrage lifted. The Japanese defenders held their fire with iron discipline. When the Shermans reached 150 yards, the entire southwestern perimeter erupted. Tank guns, 47mm anti-tank guns, and 105mm howitzers fired point-blank into the American formation. One M4A3 was destroyed outright, its ammunition cooking off in a searing fireball. 4 more Shermans shuddered to a halt, their running gear or turrets crippled by multiple hits. A drainage ditch running across the approach road trapped another tank when it tried to jump the gap and bogged nose down in the far bank. The infantry pressed forward behind the stalled tanks and began clearing the outer revetments with bazookas and rifle grenades. 2 Japanese tanks were knocked out in the initial exchange, and CPL Mizoguchi, commanding a Type 95 light tank, was credited by Japanese records with 18 hits on the American Shermans from his 37mm gun, though none penetrated. The attack stalled in the face of the concentrated fire, and by mid-morning, Dalton ordered a withdrawal to the cover of the rice paddy dikes 200 yards west of the town. American casualties in this first assault were 8 killed and 63 wounded, but while the southwestern thrust had been bloodied, the secondary attack by 2nd Battalion, 161st Infantry, probing the northern edge of the town, secured a foothold in a few buildings before nightfall. Over the next 3 days, the reduction of San Manuel settled into a methodical block-by-block siege. Dalton's preferred tactic, refined through bitter experience, paired a single infantry scout with each Sherman or M7 105mm howitzer. The scout crawled forward and showed the vehicle commander the precise location of a camouflaged Japanese revetment. The tank or howitzer then maneuvered to an angle that stripped away the bamboo and foliage with high explosive blasts, exposing the Shinhoto Chiha underneath. The 105mm howitzer proved deadly in this role. Its powerful shell did not need to penetrate the armor because the concussion and fragmentation often cracked the riveted hull or set the engine. Compartment on fire by January 26th, 2nd Battalion had fought its way through the northern half of the town, and Dalton ordered 1st Battalion to shift its axis of attack from the heavily defended southwestern corner to join the push from the north. The Japanese garrison was being ground down by the hour. Tank after tank was blasted in its revetment. Infantry squads defending the rifle pits and machine gun emplacements around each tank position were cut down by American small arms fire or buried alive by the 4.2-inch mortars. A Japanese tanker recorded the relentless rhythm. Around dawn, we received the order for all personnel to take their battle positions. I immediately jumped into the tank. The enemy artillery shelling became terrific. When the artillery finally ceased firing, I could distinctly notice the enemy automatic rifle fire sounding like roasting beans, and the sound of our heavy machine guns could be heard intermingled with the enemy's. He noted that 2 American tanks had been destroyed and one was burning, and my confidence was great. It was a fleeting hope. The attack described at the outset of this film, the night rush of 13 tanks, was the final convulsion of the Shigemi Group. 10 of the 13 tanks were halted inside the American perimeter. Only 3 tanks pulled back and escaped eastward out of the town. Major General Shigemi, recognizing that his stand-to-the-death order had destroyed his command, performed harakiri inside his headquarters. The night assault Shigemi had ordered collapsed with 10 tanks destroyed and 3 fleeing eastward. Approximately 400 survivors, many of them walking wounded, slipped out of the southeastern edge of the town with 7 tanks and made for St. Nicholas. At 13:30 hours on January 29th, San Manuel was declared secure. The destruction of the Shigemi Group at San Manuel was only one act in the wider annihilation of the 2nd Armored Division, while Dalton's 161st Regimental Combat Team was reducing the town. The 6th Division had laid siege to the Ida Group at Muñoz, commanded by Colonel Kumpai Ida of the 6th Tank Regiment. Ida had fortified Muñoz with 48 Type 97 medium tanks, 16 47mm anti-tank guns, and a battery of 4 105mm field guns, dug into tank revetments ringing the town. The siege began on January 31st and devolved into a brutal block-by-block struggle under the pounding of 5 American artillery battalions. Colonel Ida was killed by shellfire early in the battle, and by February 6th ammunition and fuel were nearly exhausted. The garrison, unaware of the exact configuration of American forces around the town, decided to break out under cover of darkness. Around 0300 hours on February 7th, a diversionary attack by 4 tanks and supporting infantry struck the American 35th Infantry's lines, while the main column, tanks, trucks, and artillery tractors roared out of Muñoz on Highway 5 towards San Jose. The column blundered almost immediately into a roadblock erected by the 63rd Infantry. Then the night erupted. 105mm and 155mm howitzers of the 53rd and 80th Field Artillery Battalions, positioned virtually atop the highway, fired point-blank into the Japanese column as it bunched against the roadblock. The first vehicles exploded, their ammunition cooking off in white flashes that illuminated the rest of the column like a procession of silhouettes. An M4 tank company of the 44th Tank Battalion, deployed in the darkness nearby, began systematically destroying the tail of the column. Unable to see their targets clearly, the American gunners improvised a grim technique. They sprayed 30 caliber coaxial machine gun fire into the dark, and when a tracer round ricocheted off Japanese armor with a shower of sparks, the 75mm gun fired on the flash. Vehicle after vehicle caught fire, the flames providing light for the next round. By dawn, the carnage was complete. 247 Japanese troops lay dead along the highway. 10 Type 97 medium tanks were destroyed, as were 10 trucks and 2 artillery tractors with their 105mm howitzers. A few hundred men escaped into the hills on foot. The Ida Group had ceased to exist. The Harada Group, dug in at Lupao and San Isidro, attempted a different escape, sabotage the remaining vehicles, and slip away into the mountains at night. One tank detachment of 10 or 11 tanks tried to race out of Lupao in the darkness. About half were destroyed by the cordon of the 35th Infantry, while 5 escaped into the hills. When the 161st Infantry occupied San Isidro on February 6th, they found 23 tanks, 18 trucks, and 2 75mm field guns abandoned or sabotaged in the town. By the end of the first week of February, the 2nd Armored Division had lost approximately 180 tanks and 2,000 troops in the northern Luzon sector. Lieutenant Colonel Takao Maeda, commander of the 7th Tank Regiment, retreated into the mountains with a handful of survivors. Lieutenant General Yoshiharu Iwanaka, the division commander, found himself commanding an improvised infantry force armed with rifles and grenades. Its armor gone, its striking power annihilated in a string of fortified towns that had delayed the American advance by barely 3 weeks. By the second week of February, the northern Luzon plain had become a vast scrapyard of Japanese armor. Forward observers counted 180 medium tanks and 2,000 troops lost in less than a month, a tally that would rise to 197 Chihas and 19 Hagos by March, as patrols probed the foothills. General Yamashita's mountain bastion strategy had purchased exactly a few weeks of delay, and the price was the destruction of the only armored division Japan had committed to the Pacific outside the home islands. The American divisions that bypassed San Manuel, Muñoz, and Lupao had already seized San Jose on February 4th, collapsing the last line before the Cordillera Central, and the remnants of the 2nd Armored Division simply dissolved into the rain-soaked trails leading upward into the pine forests. What remained of the division was not a tank force at all. Major General Iwanaka gathered the surviving staff officers, mechanics, signalmen, and dismounted tank crews, men who had once ridden into battle in steel, and reconstituted them as an ad hoc light infantry regiment. Their heavy weapons were gone, their fuel tanks empty, their trucks abandoned on the valley roads. Some of them still carried the small personal tools of their trade, a gunner's quadrant, a commander's signal flag, a driver's asbestos glove lining. Now they dug foxholes with entrenching tools and prepared to fight as riflemen in a mountain campaign that would stretch into August. The 5th Tank Company of the 10th Tank Regiment, which had been dispatched into the mountains near Baguio before the January-February fighting, remained the division's last intact armored subunit, its handful of Type 97 Kai machines hidden under bamboo and palm fronds near the trail junction at Aritao. Lieutenant Colonel Maeda, the commander of the shattered 7th Tank Regiment, vanished with the spring rains. No American intelligence report recorded his capture. No Japanese monograph names his final fate. The available division records simply stop listing his name after the first week of February, suggesting he died somewhere on the mountain trail between San Isidro and the Villaverde track, or that he dissolved into the anonymous tide of starving, sickened soldiers who succumbed to malaria and malnutrition in the high passes. His regiment, which had crossed the Lingayen beaches 4 years earlier as a spearhead of conquest, ended not with a surrender ceremony, but with scattered bones in unmarked graves. The Harada Group's escaped tanks, meanwhile, rumbled and creaked along narrow logging roads, their crews watching the temperature gauges of engines starved for proper lubricants and spare parts. 2 months later, on a winding stretch of Route 9, between Baguio and Sablan, the last act of Japanese armored aggression on Luzon played out in almost total silence. A single Type 97 Kai and a single Type 95 light tank had been fitted with explosive charges on their hull fronts, not shaped charges designed to penetrate, but simple bulk explosives strapped to the bow plates, intended to detonate on contact. The crews were volunteers. Their mission, a deliberate one-way attack against American armor, pushing up the Irisan Gorge toward the Yamashita headquarters at Baguio. They waited inside a dense stand of bamboo, where the road bent sharply around a limestone outcrop, their engines off, their hatches dogged shut against the midday heat, listening for the distinctive clatter of Sherman tracks on asphalt. The American platoon belonged to Company B of the 775th Tank Battalion, 3 M4 mediums grinding uphill in column. When the lead tank rounded the bend, a 47mm round struck it squarely, disabling the vehicle. The second Sherman attempted to reverse, but its driver misjudged the road's edge. The tank slewed and plunged 400 feet into the ravine, taking its crew with it, while medics scrambled forward under the covering gun of the third tank. The 2 Japanese machines burst from the bamboo in a shower of shattered stalks, racing directly at the immobilized column. The Type 97 Kai rammed the damaged lead Sherman. The Type 95 slammed into the third tank behind it, and the trapped American crews braced for the detonation of the explosive packs. Nothing happened. The charges, hastily assembled from demolition blocks and inadequately fused, failed to ignite on impact. Inside the crippled lead Sherman, a gunner who had remained at his station sighted through his M71D telescope and fired a 75mm armor-piercing round directly into the Japanese tank at a range of perhaps 15 feet, punching through the thin frontal plate and killing the crew instantly. The Type 95, still pressed against the third M4, was engaged by tanks further back in the column, its light armor offering no more resistance than a tin shed. Both Japanese vehicles burned where they sat, their crews incinerated, their mission ending as a footnote in a campaign that had already proved the utter inadequacy of massed suicide tactics against coordinated firepower. The photograph that survives from this campaign is worth more than 1,000 after-action reports. 13 gaunt American officers, the so-called Dirty Dozen of the 161st Infantry, the last of an original cadre of 114 who had entered combat on Guadalcanal in 1942, posed in front of a captured Shinhoto Chiha, whose armor had been peeled open by shellfire, Their faces show the exhaustion of men who had spent 6 days methodically dismantling a tank regiment revetment by revetment, block by block. That single regiment had broken the heaviest concentration of Japanese armor ever committed in the Pacific War, and it did so not through superior tank-on-tank dueling, but through the grinding, unglamorous discipline of combined arms siege warfare. The Type 97 Kai, designed in a desperate crash program after Normanhan, had been asked to do more than its thin armor and underpowered gun could ever deliver, and the decision to treat it as a disposable pillbox rather than a maneuvering sword had sealed the fate of thousands of Japanese tankers. The 2nd Armored Division's wastage, split apart, dug in, and annihilated in detail, laid bare the fatal consequences of industrial neglect married to a doctrine that could imagine no better use of armor than to bury it. Japan had entered the war with tanks comparable to the M3 Stuart. It ended the war with tanks that could not reliably penetrate the front of a Sherman, except at suicide distances. The men who survived the battles of San Manuel, Muñoz, and Lupao went on to fight through the summer in the mountains of northern Luzon. Colonel James Dalton continued to command the 161st Infantry through the Luzon campaign. First Lieutenant Robert Courtwright survived the loss of his tank at Urdaneta and eventually returned to duty. Warrant Officer Kojiro Wada died inside his Shinho Tochiha, one of the first Japanese tankers killed in that brief savage duel. But the question that hung over the entire campaign had already been answered in the rice paddies and bamboo thickets of January and February. Courage and tactical improvisation, however ferocious, could not bridge a technological gap that had been allowed to yawn into an unbridgeable chasm. We hope this chapter of history has resonated with you. If you have a personal connection to the Pacific Theater, perhaps a family member who served in the Philippines, a story passed down about those long months of 1945, or any memory at all from that era, please share it in the comments below. Your stories keep this history alive in ways no documentary alone can achieve. If you found this film valuable, we would be deeply grateful if you would subscribe and like the video, supporting our ongoing effort to preserve these extraordinary accounts of ordinary men caught in the machinery of war.